We have Michael Matheson joining us today from the SNP and our current Transport Minister. Thank you very much for joining us and a very warm welcome. And Alistair Dalton from the Scotsman will be chairing our event again. Before I hand over to Alistair, I will just run through some very quick Zoom protocols, which a lot of you have seen before, but we have quite a few new people here, so I'll just run through it quickly. Let me just share my screen. And there we go. So please make sure that you're on mute throughout the call when you're not speaking. And if you do speak, please introduce yourself before speaking. Alistair will be asking most of the questions directly that you've sent in before, simply because of time constraints. Makes everything go a bit faster and means that we can get to more of our questions. But please do introduce yourself if you are asked to speak. And then pass back to the chair once you've finished speaking. We do encourage you to use the chat function though for any comments you have, but also additional questions. If you put a Q before any of the questions, that helps us with seeing them, and then they're more likely to be asked. And in terms of troubleshooting, if your connection fails, just give it a couple seconds, see whether it reboots. Otherwise, just click on the original invite link again, and you should get back into the call, and we'll readmit you. And finally, we are recording the call, and we'll be sharing it on our website. So please just be aware of that. Thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll hand over to Alistair.
Well, thanks very much, Marie. And as you mentioned, I'm Alistair Dalton. I'm the transport correspondent of the Scotsman and scourge of all transport ministers. And talking of transport ministers, we have one with us today for this final hustings, or in fact, more accurately, Scotland's first Transport Secretary, Michael Matheson, and a warm welcome to you, Michael. Now that's significant because Michael's appointment nearly 3 years ago reflected transport's increasing importance to the Scottish Government, him being the first to hold that post at cabinet rank. Michael is also distinguished at being among, I calculate, only about 15 MSPs seeking re-election who have served continuously since the Scottish Parliament was established in 1999, and that's among more than 300. Michael started off as a list member for Central Scotland, and he has represented West for the last 14 years. He's also been on the front bench for most of his time as an MSP, in opposition on justice, rural development, culture and sport, and then in government as Minister for Public Health and Sport, followed by time as Justice Secretary before becoming Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity Secretary in 2018. Michael is an occupational therapist by profession. He's also a keen walker, cyclist and international train traveller, though to my astonishment, since he's now responsible for it, I discovered when I last interviewed him that he had yet to travel on the Caledonian Sleeper. Now, I've no idea if Michael would like to return to his job as Transport Secretary if the SNP is re-elected, but he'll be pleased to have got various major transport projects completed, like the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route. However, there's a lot of unfinished business, like getting vehicles off pavements, getting Prestwick Airport sold, securing ScotRail's future shape, completing dualling of the A9, and of course, getting those Calmac ferries finished. Now, before I ask Michael to set out his transport priorities, I'd like to introduce Transform Scotland's expert panel, who I'll be bringing in to respond to his answers to questions. First of all, our bus expert today is Julianne Robertson, who chairs Transform Scotland, in addition to her day job as communications manager for Explore Dundee, the city's main bus operator. Welcome back, Julianne. For rail and road building, I'll be turning to Paul Tetlaw once again, who's the convener, the policy forum convener for Transform Scotland. Hello, Paul. And joining us on the panel for the first time this year to comment on walking, wheeling and cycling is Claire Daly, who's Head of Policy and Communications for Sustrans Scotland. Welcome, Claire. And finally, returning to comment on demand management and road pricing will be Transform Scotland policy member Roger Humphrey. Hello again, Roger. Right, I'll kick things off by asking Michael to set out his stall on transport in no more than 5 minutes, please. And when you hear the alarm, you'll know it's time to wind up, and then we'll go to questions. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and for your kind introduction, and thank you very much to Transform Scotland for your invitation to join you here this afternoon and for organising today's event. Transport policy will play a significant role in helping to make sure that Scotland is able to achieve its objective of becoming a net zero nation by 2045. And to deliver that change, it will be necessary for us to make sure that we make the right investments in transport and also take forward the right policy to assist us in delivering in doing so. We start that process, though, building on very strong foundations and a good base. Over the course of the last Parliament alone, we've seen record investment in our railways, not only with more seats now being available on key routes, but with new stations and services opening in different parts of the country. We're also taking forward the biggest investment in the history of this Parliament through our investment of £500 million in bus prioritisation, sitting alongside the significant investment that we've been making to support the decarbonisation of our public bus fleet. And over the last few years alone, we've more than doubled our investment in active travel, with investment this year at £115.5 million for active travel programmes. And alongside that, we have also made a commitment that we will invest at least £500 million in active travel infrastructure over the course of the next parliamentary term. But we must build on the progress that we have made to date in investing in our transport infrastructure. And while we want to sustain our investments in rail and bus, we also have to ensure that we make further investments to deliver the type of transformational change that we are all looking for. That's why over the course of the next Parliament, we have made a commitment, if re-elected, to ensure that 10% of the transport capital budget will go towards active travel investment. And alongside that, we'll also take forward policies to progress our commitment to reducing car kilometres by 20% by 2030. We're also progressing our commitment to deliver free bus travel for everyone under the age of 22. And alongside that, we've made a commitment to taking forward and establishing a community bus fund to help to support our partners and local authorities to look at different bus models that they can use within their respective areas and to tackle the issue of challenges around bus delivery in certain parts of the country. We also want to make sure that our younger generation are able to get the benefits from the active travel investment that we're making, particularly the new infrastructure that is starting to be delivered and will be delivered, by ensuring that they have access to a bike. And that's why we've made a commitment at this election to ensure that any child of school age who's unable to afford a bike has access to a free bike. Alongside that, in decarbonising our bus network and investing in our active travel infrastructure, we want to continue with the very ambitious plans we have for the decarbonisation of our rail network. And alongside that, investing in new routes such as the Leavenmouth line reopening and an extension to the Borders Railway. But of course, one of the most significant things that's happened in rail in the course of the last 2 months has been our decision to take ScotRail back into public ownership when the franchise comes to an end next March. My final point though, Alistair, is that making change around transport and people's behaviour is not just about delivering more trains or buses or more active travel infrastructure. It's also about changing communities. And that's why we will work closely with our partners and local authorities to look at how we can make sure that we reclaim some of our town centres and local neighbourhoods to be much more suitable for people living their lives on a daily basis, with the creation of 20-minute neighbourhoods, looking at taking cars and vehicles out of these neighbourhoods and also looking at making them safer for children and families to live. And on that note, I'll draw my remarks to a close ahead of your buzzer.
That's very, very impressive. You're about 3 seconds under. I've normally had to hurry people up. So thanks very much for that summary. I want to start with road building. A question from Chris Day, who says you've committed to reducing road traffic by 20% by 2030. At the same time, your government is investing in a multi-billion-pound road building programme. How does this fit together, and how will you prevent this leading to an increase in road traffic and ensure that the 20% target is met?
So I don't subscribe to this view that we should, in order to meet the target, that we in some way have to end any type of road infrastructure investment. Road infrastructure investment is critical to our economy and helping to support parts of the country. And that's why we have a commitment for the dualling of the A9 and also for the A96, and also for investment in road infrastructure in other parts of the country, such as replacing the Rest and Be Thankful, given the challenges which we face there. But alongside that, we need to take measures that helps to constrain the use of car use. And that's why we've, for example, in the Transport Act, we introduced measures such as workplace parking levies, which can be utilised by local authorities in order to help to try and change behaviour and how people make use of accessing town and city centres. And what we'll also do is we'll also take forward a wider range of policies to help to try and help to change people's travelling behaviour in the making use of cars. There's a couple of areas within this that are not entirely within our gift to meet our objective of the 20% reduction. Part of that is around road tax and fuel tax, which are reserved to the UK government, although I am aware that the UK Treasury are presently looking at both fuel and road tax and potential changes to that in order to help to reduce car usage. So it'll be a combination of policies that we can take forward at a Scottish Government level. There'll be measures that the UK Government will also have to look at taking forward, which they're already looking at. And alongside that, making sure that we make our public transport system an attractive proposition for individuals to make modal shift to. And a combination of these factors will all play their part in meeting that objective. But equally, we need to also have good road infrastructure to help to sustain and support our economy, and particularly in some of our rural communities.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to bring Paul Tetlow to comment on this in a minute, but just to push you a bit further about this reduction in road traffic, that the trends have been going in the wrong direction since devolution under successive administrations. So as well as workplace parking levies, won't further constraints like some sort of congestion charging be inevitably required at some stage?
Well, clearly local authorities could take that forward just now if they choose to do so. One of the things that I think will be critical here is helping to repurpose and reshape our city and town centres to help to encourage people to make sure that when they are accessing, they're using public transport or active travel for doing so, rather than using private cars for doing so. So policies such as workplace parking levy will play a part in helping to support that. A key part in doing that is the need for, as we set out in the Act, is for local authorities to develop local transport strategies for how they will deliver that and how they will create that transformation within their respective areas. investment in bus infrastructure. One of the things that I've been very keen since I've come into the transport portfolio is to get a greater focus on bus than has been the case historically. We need to keep in mind is that buses move about 75 to 80% of all individuals that are making use of our public transport network. And they also play a bigger part for those who are on lower incomes. And I'm very keen to make sure that we see a growth in our expansion of bus networks and support for the bus industry to help to support people in making greater use of it and seeing it as a more attractive option. So that again will play a part in helping to reduce people in making use of their cars. So I think it's not one thing or another. It's going to be a combination of things, Alistair. And what we need to do is to take all of these forward in a progressive way that help to create that transformation that we're looking for.
Thanks. Paul Tetlow, could you briefly comment on that rather than asking another question? But you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, unmuted now. Yeah, I would like to comment, but pose a little question, if I may, at the end. Minister, you've answered the point about the A9 dualling, which you'll be aware lots of people here are concerned about. But you'll know that the A9 is in direct competition with the Highland Main Line, and the government has stated policies to make the train quicker than the car between Scotland's cities. So I just wonder what ambition you have for the Highland Main Line, because you'll know it's a largely single track Victorian railway. Trying to put extra trains on there is welcome in terms of a timetable, but it's simply trying to squeeze a quart out of a pint pot, if you like. It's likely to cause more delays. So what is the similar ambition for the Highland Main Line, similar level of ambition in terms of capital investment and indeed making it quicker by train than by car between the cities, please?
Okay, well, you'll be aware we've already just invested over £50 million in improvements to the Highland Main Line, which has allowed us to include extension of some of the loops and to help to improve some of the infrastructure on the line itself. One of the things that Network Rail are doing for us just now is looking at the potential for electrification of part of the Highland Main Line, which would allow us to help reduce journey time and also help to reduce or improve resilience on the route as well. Some of that may also involve some further track work and improvements on the existing infrastructure. I'm not going to give you a commitment to saying we're going to dual it because that's not on our agenda at the present moment, but helping to reduce journey times yet further and also the range of services that can be provided both for passenger and also for freight. However, one of the things that I have put to Network Rail in taking this work forward is that it needs to deliver resilience in the route as well. So in potentially looking at electrification of the line, I have raised concerns about them and how that could be adversely impacted during winter months on some key parts of the route. And I've asked them to look specifically at what additional measures could be taken to help to improve resilience of the line if we were to switch to being an electrified line. So, so there will be further investment and the work that Network Rail are taking forward will help to inform exactly what that will be and what it will look like. A key part of it will be looking at the potential electrification of the line.
Thanks for that. Another question on road building, this time from Transform Scotland's director, Colin Howden, who says, the Welsh Government have recently cancelled road schemes. When will Scotland follow Wales and say no to any road scheme?
Well, keep in mind that the decision around Wales and cancelling that scheme was for a variety of different reasons. It wasn't solely on an environmental basis. So, and also there is also a push now from the UK government for the part of the scheme to be reconsidered and redeveloped. What we aren't doing is we've set out in our national transport strategy is simply investing in our road infrastructure for unconstrained growth of car use. So one of the criticisms we had around the the development of the Queensferry crossing was that it wasn't built and designed on the basis of having been there to meet unconstrained growth in road traffic. And the reason for that was because it was not designed to, or a policy objective is to reduce car traffic, in particular, or road traffic where we can. Some of the investments we're making in places like Inverness is to help to support and sustain the economy and for safety purposes. Equally the same on areas around the A90, 96. But most of the other road projects that we're taking forward are actually about enhancing and improving communities. So, for example, the investment we're making in something on the investment we're making in the A77 and the Maple bypass will transform Maple as a town. It's something that's been called on for many times, or for many years. It's an investment that will not only make Maple as a town centre safer, but it will also allow the community to make and redesign their town centre in a significant way. So elements of the investment we're making will not just be about enhancing the network and improving the network, it's also about helping to support communities and making them safer and allowing them the opportunity to redesign their town and community centres. So as we've set out in our national transport strategy, we're not investing in roads purely for unconstrained growth, but we are taking forward investments that we see as being a priority. And the final point I'll make on this, Alistair, if you also look at the infrastructure investment plan, which we're taking forward, the shift in our investment on road is toward maintenance as opposed to new road infrastructure in a very significant way. I've taken that forward very deliberately as a policy in government because I know and recognise the concerns that have been expressed around road building, but we are making a big shift from new roads into maintenance of our existing infrastructure and making better use of existing infrastructure. So if I was to say one thing to you, I think the days of big road development projects are coming to an end, and you will see more strategic investments in our road network, which are about enhancing existing infrastructure in order to deliver better communities, safer roads, and also helping to support local and regional economies.
Thanks. Now, I should have brought in Roger Humphrey to comment on whether there's a need for more measures like road pricing type measures. So Roger, would you like to comment at this stage about whether we need more of the stick as well as the carrot?
Yes. So I mean, I think there are various different ways of trying to manage traffic demand, and one important way is space. And I think it is important that you have said that the era of big road projects is coming to an end, because one of the ways of managing traffic demand is through space. You can't just keep feeding it. But another way is through the various forms of taxation, and you've mentioned the workplace parking levy. There's concern looking a little bit further ahead, and I think you referred to this, to do with road taxes. The concern is that we now have almost exponential growth in electric vehicle uptake. We've got targets set by both governments on the production and I guess even the use, I can't quite remember, of the petrol or diesel vehicles. The tide has turned. It's clear that electric vehicles are coming, and they're coming fast. Now, the marginal use, the driving cost of an electric vehicle is very small at the moment, very small compared to its competitors, maybe a third or a quarter of the price. So it's not only is it that much cheaper than going by petrol or diesel, it's it's a lot cheaper than going by bus. So my family, I have to justify very hard on environmental basis or social basis that we take the bus when it's costing maybe 5 times as much or more to go on a return trip to Perth from where we live compared to our electric vehicle. Now, history tells us that once people get used to a thing being at a particular price, they're politically, in a sense, sort of addicted to it, and it's very difficult to then start pushing that price up. So it's really important that governments start to realize this ahead of that even wider scale uptake of electric vehicles. And the UK government is discussing this, but I think it's also really important that whichever Scottish government we have in the future has a strong view on it and is seeking to introduce some sort of method for taxing the usage of electric vehicles, even if, to start off with, the level of taxation is low or zero. It is important that we get that measure agreed upon and put in so that we don't get caught out. Some very crude modeling that I did, extrapolation of the relationship between the price of fuel and the number of miles traveled, suggests that we could be expecting about a 10 to 20% increase in traffic just due to the cheapness of running an electric vehicle. So the question is, does the SNP have a strong view at the moment, or any strong views as to how we constrain the usage of electric vehicles or hydrogen if they come in later, once they become more abundant?
So I think, Roger, you make a really good point. Once people get used to having something for a very low cost or for free, is that rolling back in that becomes really challenging. A good example of that actually is happening in my own constituency, where at the charging hub at Falkirk Stadium, Falkirk Council have recently started to introduce some charges. And it's been interesting, the reaction that's drawn from EV drivers who've been making use of it. Even though local authorities have the ability to introduce charges for the use of them, but it's been interesting in the, what I would say, a bit of the backlash that there has been around doing that, given that actually it's got to be part of a mix. So one of the things that Transport Scotland are doing just now is they're taking forward some work to try and model and look at how charging, for example, for the charging network, how charging at different levels on the electric charging network has an impact on people's behaviour. And whether it makes do you just think that you can continue to use your electric vehicle unconstrained because it's very cheap, or it's free for you. And then once you start to rack that up, you then start to see what impact it has on people's behaviour. So some of the work that they're doing just now is to try and look at what different rates of charging on the vehicle charging network would have on an individual's behaviour. So it's going to have to play a part of how we constrain people's behaviour, Roger, going forward. And that is the cost which is associated with charging. But also, can I say to you that there is a need for us to have a mature political debate around how we deal with some of these issues. You just have to reflect back on the nature of the political debate we had around something fairly straightforward and simple as the workplace parking charge, and the way in which politically it just turned into a complete and utter hot potato, which only got through because of our support and the support of the Green Party in Parliament. And that was just to empower local authorities to look at it. So there is a challenge here for all political parties to make sure that we are being honest and open with people about what measures may be necessary, including some of the controversial measures that may be necessary going forward, and to have a debate around those in a mature and sensible way, rather than being one which is actually just driven by short-term political advantage.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to come on to buses and active travel in a moment, but just one other thing about roads. There was a surprise line in the SNP manifesto about a new bridge, which seemed to be missed by the Strategic Transport Projects Review, because the SNP are planning a Gourock to Dunoon link. So John Yellowlees, who's ScotRail's honorary ambassador, is asking, will that bridge include a deck for rail?
So it's not been missed by the STPR process. It's actually presently part of it. So we are looking at the potential for a number of different fixed links to some of our island and rural communities, which would reduce the need for a reliance on the ferry network. So some of those could be bridges, causeways, or it could be tunnels, all of which are part of the STPR2 process. Some of them were actually part of the engagement we had around the alternatives to the A83 Rest and Be Thankful, which we recently had a consultation on. It looked at 11 different options, including the potential for a bridge or fixed link across to Dunoon. The other thing that we need to keep in mind here, though, Alistair, is that infrastructure investment isn't just about rail or transport in itself. It's also about tackling issues such as depopulation and economic decline in communities. And one of the key things that we can see in areas such as in Argyll, where there's an ongoing issue around depopulation, is that transport and digital connectivity play an important part in helping to support and sustain communities. And we need to look at what are the most effective options that can help to support and sustain these communities, because depopulation economically and socially could end up leaving some of these communities in real difficulty in the years ahead. But
extending the railway over that bridge to Dunoon would seem to assist with the reduction of emissions rather than just creating more capacity for roads.
So let's wait and see what comes out of STPR2 and the phase 2 report, and we can then look at what the options are if there's a strong case for looking at having a fixed link and what that fixed link should be and what it should be there for. But as I say, I want to emphasise this point: infrastructure is also about helping to support and sustain communities and tackle issues such as depopulation. And in parts of Argyll, that's a key issue of concern.
Okay. I'm going to pass on a comment from the panel just to try and sort of move things on as we're halfway through the session. I want to move to active travel, and it's a question from Andrew Lindsay of Sustrans, who's asking, why has the SNP only committed to increasing the budget to 10% of transport capital budget when 3 of the other 4 major parties have committed to at least 10% of total transport budget? And he's saying that if we take the current year's budget as an example, this would represent a difference of almost 150 million. Yeah, so why not be more ambitious on the active travel spend?
Well, look, I think it's a good question, and it's a fair question from Sustrans, who secured a significant amount of money from us on investing in active travel infrastructure through our existing programme. The reality is that the vast majority of investment infrastructure is through capital budgets. It's not through revenue budgets. I don't know where the other parties in saying their transport budget recognise the difference between revenue and capital. The capital budgets are responsible for delivering infrastructure, so it would be your capital budget that would be responsible for delivering that in the way in which it is at the present moment. So that's why our commitment is very clearly for that purpose. Equally, if you want to include revenue budgets within it as well, you also have to then decide upon which part of your revenue budget do you want to cut. So do you want to cut revenue for free bus travel for those who are 60 and over, or those who are 22 and under? Do you want to cut revenue funding that you put into a range of other public transport measures, such as our ferry network, to help to subsidise it for the road equivalent tariff scheme? So if the question for other parties is that if they're committing to 10% of the entire transport budget, they're proposing cuts to the revenue budget, which will have a direct impact on service delivery, because that funding will have to come from somewhere else.
I'm going to bring in Claire Daly to respond to that. Claire, is more than 10% the transport budget feasible? Because the Greens, for instance, are looking for it to be increased to 20%.
Well, I think if you look at some other countries, and I'm from the Republic of Ireland, and recently there's been an increase in the budget there to 20% of the transport budget to be spent on active and sustainable travel. It can be done. I think it's a case of understanding the importance of how capital and revenue interact with each other, particularly in the area of active travel, because there's such a strong behavior change element to it. And I think that that's a really, really important point. And where we've had considerable success, for example, working with local authorities on implementing capital schemes, like, for example, the South City Way, which Mr. Matheson, of course, will be very familiar with. Part of that has had related funding on engaging communities along the way, in getting involved in the mode shift and getting involved in realizing the benefits from that. So I think making a distinction, you know, it is important, and certainly it's important from a budget management point of view, but I don't think it's a good distinction to say either or. And I think my colleague, you know, my colleague's question, Andrew's question, was very much about clarification, you know, just so we can understand what the 10% means.
Okay. Another aspect of active travel is physical obstructions. And one thing which is keenly awaited by many people is the forthcoming ban on pavement parking. So David French wants to know, when will that actually be implemented?
So it's a good question, because it's a bane of many people's lives, including my own, and where I stay at times as well. So you'll be aware we've created the legal provision within the Transport Act. However, the Transport Act is actually having, you know, previously been a Justice Secretary who, very often you're taken through lots of different legislations as a Justice Secretary. The Transport Act is actually one of the most complex pieces of legislation that I've ever taken through Parliament. And one of the biggest pieces of legislation I've ever taken through Parliament, because it's a multi-topic piece of legislation. So the measures for pavement parking require local authorities to take forward assessments within their local authority area, because you'll be aware that they have the ability to provide for areas where the streets are too narrow, and that vehicle parking will still be allowed on the pavements. They have to undertake an assessment to carry that out. So because of the COVID situation, officials at Transport Scotland who are dealing with this had to deal with matters relating to the pandemic. As a consequence, the work that they were taking forward to develop the guidance for local authorities to carry out that work, it was paused. However, that work started towards the end of last year, and they expect to get that consultation underway. And I think it's by the summer of this year, so local authorities can be consulted on the guidance and then look to take forward the assessment work that they require to take forward before the enforcement provisions start to be introduced. So if I was to say to you, when do I expect that provision to be in place, the local authorities will probably need about a year to carry out that assessment work. I would imagine 9 months to a year. So I would say that it's probably going to be into 2023 before local authorities will start to be in a position where they can take forward the necessary enforcement action and designate the streets where pavement parking will not be permitted.
Thank you. And if I could go back to Claire, what do you make of that progress report?
There needs to be greater progress on pavement, on eliminating pavement parking, and we just want to see it happen as soon as possible. I mean, that's the fundamental point, I think, about that. And you know, this is something that it's, you know, going through the kind of consultations in the run-up to the transport bill. It seems like there's a very strong, while there are other areas of active travel and use of street space, I think there's unanimity right across the piece on pavement parking and the nuisance that it creates for people with disabilities, for older people, for people with families, with small children. And, you know, it's part of kind of, again, but until we prioritize places for people, this kind of conflict is going to keep coming up. And it's something that we'll certainly be watching very closely.
Now, buses, Michael mentioned, needs more focus. As he said, it's the major public transport. And I'll bring Julianne in to respond to what Michael says about this. But question from Gavin from Friends of the Earth. How are you going to achieve what appears to be a hugely ambitious manifesto pledge to remove the majority of fossil fuel buses from public transport in Scotland by 2023? And how many buses are we talking about?
So there's around 4,000 buses within the public transport network, and the way in which it will be taken forward is through what has been our very successful programme over the course of the last 9 months, the Scottish Ultra Low Emission Bus Fund, which we just increased. We just had an allocation of some £40 million that's delivered the most recent allocation for bus operators to decarbonise the bus fleet. So it's probably in the region of around 2,000 buses, Alistair, and it'll be taken forward through the Scottish Ultra Low Emission Bus Fund, which, as I say, is proving to be a very successful fund in helping to support the industry in shifting towards zero emission buses. It also has the wider economic benefit of companies like ADL, Alexander Dennis's, a very successful bus manufacturer based in my own constituency, been able to manufacture most of these buses, who are presently looking at the potential for expanding their capacity to take on more of that work in the years ahead. So there's not only the environmental and the social benefit that comes from it, there's also the economic benefit that comes from driving forward a policy like this.
Julianne, what do you make of that timescale? Is it achievable in 2.5 years?
Certainly raised a few eyebrows whenever myself and my colleagues when we saw that. But it's very difficult to argue with the idea, the offer of a huge amount of investment in upgrading our fleets. I suppose the worry might be that there is still a commitment expected from operators with regards to some of the funding that is provided, and in terms of resources and time, and this may put undue pressure on an industry which is already really scrambling to survive in many ways. So I suppose there's a note of caution there in terms of maybe a plea actually to make sure that you take the industry with you on these sorts of things, and consultation and discussion about how these things can be achieved is always welcome, I guess, because we want the same things, but it might be slightly unfair to kind of impose deadlines which we would worry may not be realistic.
Okay. Now, in these series of discussions, we haven't talked about air transport, but SNP policies are quite significant here. I'm not quite sure who I'll be bringing in to comment on that. Maybe Paul or Roger, whoever you feel best, or any of the panel. But Michael, has cutting air passenger duty been shelved for good?
We don't think it's compatible with our climate change objectives, so that's why we had a change in our policy and a change in our approach, which we set out, I think now must be about 18 months ago, around that. And there are no intentions for us to change our policy position on that, Alistair.
And who from the panel would like to comment on that? Any offers?
I can see Roger and Paul with their hands up.
Well, we haven't heard from Paul for a while, so Paul.
Yeah, that's very welcome to hear, Mr. Matheson. And you might have a word with your colleagues south of the border who I worry are not going in the same direction. And it's very notable what's happened in France recently, where the French government have made very clear commitments to moving shorter trips from air to rail as part of their climate change agenda. I guess what goes with all of that, given that the bulk of flights internal are central Scotland to London, a huge number, is how we progress improving the rail infrastructure from central Scotland to London and speed up enhancement of that.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you make a very good point. I think the way to reduce our reliance, particularly in domestic air travel from central Scotland to the south of England, is through enhancements in rail. I think one of the things that has disappointed me from the engagement I've had with the UK government recently, and also the stuff they had around the union connectivity review and everything, is that if they were actually serious about union connectivity, they could have actually said what they were going to do is we're going to speed up the taking forward of HS2 coming to Scotland and to other parts of the UK. That would have shown a real commitment to looking at decarbonising your transport network and also improving connectivity across mainland UK. But actually, that's not what the objective of it was anyway. It was a political objective as opposed to being a transport objective. So I think the key to addressing the issue around domestic air travel is around enhancing our rail network and in particular looking at how we can reduce journey times, particularly from the Central Belt to areas such as London.
Okay. I want to return to buses with a question about accessibility. This is from, and I'll get Julianne to comment on this after Michael. Graham Lundy, I think from Dumfries, is asking, what will you do to ensure that when the Scottish Government pays for bus fleet upgrades, that a fair share of these vehicles are issued to rural Scotland depots to increase better accessible public transport in those areas? Graham says the fleet where he is in Dumfries and Galloway is cascaded, old, end of life, and he said it makes it increasingly difficult as a wheelchair user to access public transport.
No, look, I think that's a fair point. It's a challenge that I have put to the bus industry before in my own constituency. Alexander Dennis's are producing these buses, but in Falkirk alone there are presently only 2 electric buses operating. And the discussions I've had with First Bus Midland is about how can we increase the numbers of electric buses that are available within my own constituency. So I want to see that right across, Graham, right across the was it Graham Lundy you said, Alistair?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to see that right across network, including within your own area in Dumfries and Galloway. I suppose the challenge here in some areas is it's not just so much about the electric buses, it's more to do with the grid infrastructure to be able to provide the type of charging support that's necessary for operating buses. So some of the work that we've been taking forward with the energy networks is to look at how we can make use of existing capacity in the grid infrastructure to support charging infrastructure. So one of the things that we're doing through the Scottish Low Emission Bus Fund is that we're not only supporting the decarbonisation of the fleet, we also help to support the infrastructure that's necessary for charging these vehicles to help to try and overcome some of these challenges. So that's part of the mix in how we deal with some of these issues in our rural areas, is to make sure that we've got the right charging infrastructure to support the sector. But it's a point I think it needs to continue to be taken forward to make sure that there's a fair distribution of the new decarbonised fleet across the network being delivered by the industry as more and more of these buses are rolled out.
Julianne, is the bus industry guilty of putting all its shiny new vehicles in urban areas and leaving rural dwellers with rather older buses?
It's something I find it slightly difficult to comment on. We don't run many rural services in Explore Dundee. It's a difficult one because the rural services are the ones that do tend to be there's lower patronage, and I suppose in many ways, realistically speaking, they don't get the same level of attention that perhaps they should. But I think that there is definitely an eagerness to address that. I think we would acknowledge that there needs to be a new way of looking at rural services and new ways of doing things to try and achieve the kind of services that people need and want. It's certainly not through want of trying to make services work and to use subsidies and things that will help support the services which are unfortunately underused or less used. But I think there's a willingness, as I say, to try new things, to try this new tech, to investigate the options and the boundaries of electric, and certainly hydrogen could play a big part in that as well, in terms of the longer rural routes, and that is just certainly something that the bus industry also is looking into. Adapting, how will this work? But it's all of it is still very early tech for a lot of operators, and it needs to be researched and needs to be tried out to make sure we are providing the best options on all the routes on offer. But and perhaps it may be that there needs to be some alternative thinking in terms of the services provided to rural or more remote areas, maybe demand responsive transport options and things like that. We perhaps need to be more innovative in our thinking about how we deliver these, rather than the usual format of timetables and specific services and routes. So I think it's all up for grabs, and it's something that we would hope we can really begin to examine as things move forward.
Okay, thanks for that. I think this will probably be our last question, and we haven't really talked about rail. So here's one from Ian Budd, who's the convener of the Friends of the Far North line, who says that rail in the Highlands has been rather neglected compared with the Central Belt. And given that two major intercity routes are mostly single track with few passing places, will the next government correct that?
So it's a fair point, but it's worth keeping in mind in terms of rail infrastructure investment, is that it operates not in a parliamentary cycle, but it operates in a control period cycle. And we are presently in control period 6, which will run up until 2024. So there's a time frame. So 2025. There is a time frame for the commitments we've made to be delivered within that period. There's record investment going into it. But the work I mentioned earlier on around improvements to the Highland Main Line and the work that we've asked Network Rail to take forward will help to inform future planning and investment priorities going forward. So I hope it would give you a reassurance that it's not being deprioritised in our minds by any shape of the imagination. It's a priority area for us, but the investment profile for rail is over a control period timescale as opposed to a parliamentary timescale, and anything like that is more likely to be in the next control period rather than within the existing control period.
Thank you. And Paul, could you very briefly comment on that?
I don't think there's much more I could say on that, because the Minister's kind of addressed that point. I wonder if I could ask a quick question, Minister, about the future structure of the railway in Scotland under the operator of last resort. I'm sure you can't comment on individuals, but we all know Bill Reeve and his role, and Alex Hines. I've looked at what's happened in Wales. I'm sure it's early days in coming to what structure will be put in place in Scotland, but can you give us a quick view on your thinking as to what type of structure might be put in place to bring the different parts together and to operate the railway? Thank you.
So I think, Paul, even in moving to OLR for the ScotRail franchise, doesn't, in my view, deliver the optimal structure for delivering passenger and infrastructure rail services in Scotland. I've said out on a number of occasions now, I'd like to see an integrated railway system between both infrastructure and also passenger elements of it. We don't have control over the Network Rail element of it. That's a matter that remains reserved to the UK government. Although we set priorities for Network Rail Scotland, we don't control that structure, and we don't have the powers to be able to create a single body. So what I would like to see happening is a single unified body that is responsible for both parts of the rail network and operating and planning in a coordinated fashion. However, in the absence of that, what we will have with public sector control is a board that will be able to try and work in a much closer coordinated way with Network Rail Scotland to make sure that we are addressing what have been some of the long-standing structural problems that we have within our rail network. That won't be ideal, but we can try to do it more effectively than we have been just now, on the basis that we don't have to go through a belly of ScotRail to ask them to do things or to get them to look at taking things forward. We can look at taking them forward direct to ourselves with Network Rail. So, so the model for OLR, Paul, will not be the optimal model because it will not deliver an integrated rail network. In my view, that is the best. I think that's the best way in which we could deliver rail services, but that will require the devolution of Network Rail to allow us to do that and to have a single unified public sector body that is responsible for both parts of our rail network. And just to give you a simple illustration of this, we know that the majority of delays in our rail network are not because of the operator, but because of the infrastructure. But what happens is that the operator ends up carrying responsibility for failings in the infrastructure element of it. That needs to end. What we need to have is one body that's responsible for both parts of it, and that they are held to account for both parts of it, as opposed to two different organisations able to play off against one another. And that's why an integrated body, in my view, would be the optimal model for delivering rail services in Scotland.
And that particular debate could fill another hour, but we're out of time, I'm afraid, so we're going to wind up. So thanks to everyone for your questions. Sorry that we were only able to pose some of them, but I hope we covered quite a big range of topics. Thank you, Michael Matheson, very much for fielding all those questions. And also thanks very much to our expert panel of Julianne, Paul, Claire and Roger for their views too. And with that, I'm going to return to Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. And it's been really great to be able to hear directly from our current Transport Minister today. We've heard some really positive commitments from the clear statement on air passenger duty to the very ambitious commitment on decarbonising the majority of buses in Scotland by 2023. There's been some really positive progress on decarbonising buses recently, and it'll be great to see that momentum being carried forward. Another really welcome commitment is the 20% road traffic reduction target that should be reached by 2030. There have been targets like this before, though, such as the 10% modal share target for cycling that was unfortunately never achieved and then dropped. So while it is a very positive target, we will want to see more detail on how it will be achieved before being too optimistic about it. However, the plan for this target to be met will be published later this year, I believe. So we will be looking forward to reading that plan and hope that it will include effective measures, importantly demand management measures that will ensure a reduction in journeys by private car. And another contentious point that was discussed today that was also picked up in the chat was road building, and we are hoping that the SNP will reassess how the current road building program fits with the ambitious climate targets it has set. So on the whole, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and thank you very much to Michael Matheson for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for answering all those questions. Thank you also to Alistair Dalton for chairing the event and also all of the previous events. And also thank you to the expert panel for all of their contributions. I hope that everybody who has attended today's session has found it interesting and helpful. And as Alistair has already mentioned, there were a lot of questions today, so we unfortunately weren't able to get to all of them. I hope we managed to cover quite a large range of areas. And as this is the final event, all of the events will be available on our website now. So you can watch this event again, or if you missed any of the previous ones, you can go back and watch them as well. And with that, I think we'll come to the close of our Moving the Boat event series. Thank you to everyone who's been involved. And I hope you all have a lovely sunny Friday afternoon and a good weekend coming up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.